the series, I was thinking about Chinese philosophy, which is still very much around today, as you will see in a second, and offer you some general ideas. I will focus on Confucianism and Buddhism, and Taoism. I'll mention Buddhism, but Confucianism and Taoism. And I'll keep it quite general. So there might be people with some more advanced knowledge. I'll also offer some ideas. It's impossible to cover it all in only 30 minutes. I'll try to share my screen, see if that works. Here we go. Okay, so Lois, can you see my screen?
Yep.
Yeah, all right. So the title of the talk is Learning from Chinese Philosophy in Times of Lockdown. I prepared a little text, but I think I just talk through the slides and some of the text passages that I chose. I start not in China and not in Chinese or in English, but in French, and I'll translate into English. So the last couple of months now, yeah, I think I spent too much time online and reading all kinds of things on social media. People were sharing a lot of information. And one of the things I saw was a reflection, an article written by a French businessman now, Jean-Noël Poirier, but who used to be the French ambassador to Vietnam. And he got infected by coronavirus in March while he was visiting Paris, and then went back to Vietnam. He was tested at the airport. The Vietnamese authorities found out that he was infected and had to be in quarantine in hospital for 14 days. And afterwards, he wrote his opinion piece, and he argued that a country like Vietnam did much better than Western nations. They have, I think until today, 300-something cases and 0 deaths. So that's really incredible. And what they did was to close borders with China immediately, to trace and to test and to quarantine, and the population was generally quite happy with the way the Vietnamese government dealt with the situation. But he says, in the Confucian world, like Vietnam and Korea, but also Japan and the Chinese world, China, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Singapore, governments and people dealt better with the situation just because of this Confucian perspective on the whole situation. And the main point for Poirier was that in East Asia, the interests of the group were more important than the rights of individuals. So there is this kind of collective responsibility that he praises in what he calls the Confucian world. Now, I think that it's a little bit too much black and white, and maybe the initial response of the Vietnamese government was scare, just the healthcare system wouldn't cope with a large-scale pandemic, and there were already experiences with pandemics in the recent past. I'm not going into the whole discussion, but I start with this small story because it made me think about Chinese philosophy, and Confucianism is Chinese philosophy, and how to deal with challenging times like a pandemic. And people still refer to these ideas like the Confucian ideas or the collective versus the individual or individuality in the West. Now, Chinese philosophy is very much alive. Here on the slide, you see 3 recent books, I think all written in the last 5 years. Slingerland, who talks about trying not to try, which refers to a Taoist concept, also used in Confucianism, actually. Wu Wei, or non-action, or action without intent, spontaneity, and refers also to modern psychology and science. You have a very popular book by Michael Puett, a professor at Harvard, who co-authored a book called The Path with Christine Groslow, in which he very much tells his audience how you can apply these ancient ideas to your contemporary life, and also for a Western audience, that a lot of these ideas still make sense today. You could say that these books are somewhere in between philosophy and self-help, but that's also often where Chinese philosophy is placed. And it has probably to do with the practical side of it. And then recently, this year, Roel Sterckx at Cambridge wrote an introductory book, and he also points very much out why Chinese philosophy still matters today, whether it's about health and well-being, or politics, or global popular culture. So Chinese philosophy is very much alive, I would say. We are talking about personal philosophy. Also recently, this year, a collection with essays about all kinds of philosophies, going from Stoicism to existentialism, but also with chapters on East Asian traditions. Brian Van Norden wrote an essay on Confucianism, and Robin Wang on Taoism. And these authors also argue or show how they integrate ancient Chinese thinking in their contemporary lives today. Okay. But I go back, I take you in my time machine, and we go to the earliest times in Chinese history. East Asianists, they like to talk in terms of dynasties. It starts with the Xia and the Shang and the Zhou. The Qin is the first imperial dynasty. I'll talk about that later. But when we look at the origins of the traditions I'm talking about today, Confucianism and Taoism, we can trace them back to the second half of the so-called Zhou dynasty. Confucius lived in the final years of the so-called Spring and Autumn periods, just before the Warring States period. I don't have to give you a lot of information. It means that people were living in times of major distress. Whereas previously, there was a kind of status quo. Leaders of states would look at the Zhou kings as the legitimate rulers, the ones who had the mandate of heaven, an important concept in Chinese philosophy. But now the kings, the rulers of states, started to challenging this authority of the Zhou. When we go into this Warring States period, and you can see on the slide and on the image on the left, there is a lot of change going on, and larger states are swallowing slower ones until only the Qin remains and unifies China. And unification and oneness is one of those ideals in Chinese philosophy, but how you obtain it, that's another question. A question asked by all kinds of philosophers. We have well, traditionally they are called the 100 schools. Maybe probably less, maybe or more, we don't know. There is some archaeological evidence. A lot of the texts date not from that period or the versions we have now accessible. So there is a lot of discussion about these schools. But I listed some names of schools, and they can give you an idea or not what it could mean. I highlighted the last one, the legalism. By imposing strict laws and penalizing people that went against those laws. And this philosophy became the philosophy of the so-called first emperor of China, the very famous one who has his terracotta army in Xi'an protecting him in life after death. The first so-called emperor of China, who ruled the whole empire with a strong hand. Now, legalism would influence later ideas or later Confucianism, and later Confucianism is eclectic and contains all kinds of ideas, as do other philosophies in China. Sometimes it's also difficult to draw lines between these philosophies and practices, but it's also about practice, like governing, but also taking care of yourself, for instance. Now, in Imperial China, we talk about the three teachings. So of all those 100 schools, actually the two remained influential: Confucianism and Taoism. Confucianism was important in specific periods and was more at background in others. And later, let's say around 1000 years ago, there is a revival of Confucianism, which is in Western literature called Neo-Confucianism. Taoism traces its roots back to early texts in the Warring States period, but also takes form as organized, let's call it religion, in many different shapes, actually. And then you have Buddhism, which enters China in the first century CE. And they all interact with each other in later times, becomes quite complex. Sometimes we also talk about, or in certain periods, about a unity between the three teachings. So there is no problem in some periods of time to practice both Confucianism, Taoism, and Buddhism in one and the same person would do that. In other times, in other situations, you see fierce discussions between representatives of those, let's call them, well, teachings or schools. Zhao is the Chinese term used.
Les, sorry, can I just interrupt really quickly? Someone's message to say that they're hearing a bit of background noise, which I'm hearing, I don't know if other people are hearing as well, a sort of clicking sound like typing. Just to let everyone know that I've had a look and I can't see anyone, everyone's muted. So I don't think, I'm not sure where the sound is coming from. And I don't know if there's anything on your desktop, Les, that might be, it's a very sort of, so I can't quite work out what it is. It's not really loud, but it's a minor distraction. So if anyone has any clue, they can message me and let me know. Someone said it could be a microphone on hitting the shirt of hitting your the
Oh, okay.
yeah, that could be what it is.
Maybe I try without a microphone, but then we might have some other
Maybe if you
background
just hold
noise.
it away from your.
Yeah, maybe like this. Let's see if that goes
I
better.
think that's right. I think that is what's picking up the. So I
Okay.
can hear a little bit on your fingers. So as
Yeah.
long as there's nothing touching it, it's
Okay.
quite a subtle sound. But so yes, we'll resume. I mean, as I've interrupted, I'll just highlight that I put a message to say that we're also recording Les speaking. And no one else. And I should have mentioned that at the beginning. If anyone has any concerns about that, to let me know. You could do so now, in fact, but otherwise in the discussion or by private message, and we can discard the recording, whatever. But sorry for those interruptions, Les. Let's resume.
Okay. So today I'm not going into the discussion about what is religion and what is philosophy or what do they mean by teachings, but I'll focus on some of those aspects within the traditions that are regarded to be philosophy. And I make a jump in time now and I go to the 16th century, 16th until the 18th century, and that's a period where we have a first like intensive Western engagement with East Asian traditions and with Confucianism in particular, by the Jesuits actually, missionaries who were active in China, wanted to convert Chinese intellectuals into Christianity, which didn't, well, partly successful, some converted, but the majority wrote very fierce criticism on Christian views on the world. Now, from the Jesuit perspective, and they tried to win over the elite, and they casted Confucius as a philosopher. So one of the earliest, you have here a slide with from a book with the early translation of the sayings of Confucius in Latin, and it was very clear for them that Confucianism was a philosophy. Maybe they didn't not really want to talk too much about the ritual practices. Other Christian orders criticized Jesuits for this, but obviously there are aspects that we could rather call religious within the Confucian tradition, for instance, ancestor worship. Now, when I go into Chinese philosophy, and maybe back to those Jesuits, for them, Buddhism and Taoism was something else. But Confucianism became a kind of ideal for early Enlightenment philosophers as a kind of China, a country ruled by bureaucrats, by a philosopher king at the head of this empire. But back in time and back to Chinese philosophy. So what are some of the key ideas or characteristics? It's not so much about truth like we see in the Western tradition. Chinese philosophers are, and I allude to Graham's important work, they are disputers of the way, disputers of the Tao. So they discuss the way of the world, but also the individual way in which you would behave in order to live a good life within society and or the cosmos, the larger cosmos. It's not only about thinking and words, it's also transformative practice. It's self-cultivation. It's also physical sometimes. It's how you sit, how you breathe sometimes, depending on which philosophy. The goal for all, for all philosophers in that period is harmony. So there is a huge problem with chaos and distress. And so how can we achieve harmony in an ever-changing world? Do we start with the self? Do we impose measures on the population? We saw the legalists, they had their own view on harmony. For a Taoist or a Confucian, that would also be another kind of vision. And relationships and contexts are also extremely important. And those relationships are social-political, so how you live together with other people, but also how you live in the larger environment, heaven and earth. Confucianism in the Chinese term is Rujia, which Confucianism is a Western term. Ru refers to a class of literati, experts in the classics, and experts in rituals who assisted kings of states. And Confucius did not see himself as a founder of a religion or a philosophy or a tradition, but somebody who transmitted the early ways of the Zhou. Because in the early times of the Zhou, he argued, there was harmony. And this is because rulers were virtuous. How can we learn about these traditions? By studying texts. In this earliest period, it are the so-called 5 classics, which include history works, works on rituals, there is a text on divination, and so on, poetry, history. And in later times, when we are talking about Neo-Confucianism, the 4 books become important. And the 4 books include the sayings of Confucius, Mengzi, who's another Confucian philosopher, and 2 smaller chapters from one of those 5 classics, which is on ritual. So ritual is important, but ritual is not only like sacrificing for ancestors or for previous kings. Ritual in a Confucian vision is also how you behave in life. So it also includes etiquette. And this daily life, the mundane, is really important. Confucius said that he didn't know about ghosts and spirits. Maybe they were around, but they were not that important. It was more important to create harmony in your personal life, in the present, and most of all within the family. And what you learn growing up in your family is also important for a ruler to know. So you have to rule the country as a good, or man, so as a good house father. Confucianism is criticized by some other philosophies because they focus on something called in the literature differentiated care. So you would treat people in different positions differently. The love of a child for his mother or father is different from the love of the mother to the child. A ruler should behave in a different way than a minister. So you need to know where you are, and you learn this kind of hierarchy in society within a familial context. The problem, according to Confucius, was that something went wrong with names, like fathers were not behaving like fathers anymore, kings were not behaving like kings anymore, and they also forgot, of course, the ancient ways of the Zhou. So there is a kind of, Confucianism has this conservative tendency, but it doesn't mean that it's unflexible. So there is space for change, and it's very pragmatic. I have a quote from the Analects taken from readings in classical Chinese philosophy. If you're interested in Chinese philosophy, that's a good collection with texts from diverse traditions, not only Confucianism and Taoism. The first saying in the Analects reads, the master said, to learn and then have occasion to practice, what you have learned? Is this not satisfying? To have friends arrive from afar, is this not a joy? To be patient even when others do not understand, is this not the mark of the gentleman? So learning is and practicing is essential in Confucianism, and the idea is also that you live a good and happy life. And friends, social relationships are really important. So knowing wisdom is not about some abstract truths, but how you behave in life. Sometimes you need some patience too, because others might not really be able to understand you. That's also the irony that Confucius never really secured a major position as an advisor to a king, because kings were more interested in personal benefits and in warfare. And Confucian philosophy was not considered to be practical. But he became the greatest sage within Chinese civilization. Virtue is important, and Confucianism is considered to be a form of virtue ethics. So you have to cultivate some essential virtues that other philosopher I already mentioned, Mengzi, singled out 4 important ones: benevolence or humanity, righteousness, also called integrity, wisdom, knowledge, propriety, which is also translated as ritual. And every human being has sprouts of these virtues in the heart, mind, xin in Chinese. It can be clouded. Some people never develop them, but under ideal circumstances, everyone is good. And there is a famous saying of a child falling in a well, and every human being has the intention to save the child. Well, that's what Mengzi argues, and that's his argument for that people are humane. Also, heaven for Mengzi is humane. Filial piety, loyalty, all these other virtues are important as well. Now, there are many different voices within the Confucian tradition, so it's not that everyone agreed. And I already mentioned Mengzi. There is another one called Xunzi, who lived slightly later, just before the unification by the Qin, and actually he is also the intellectual fathers of legalists, important legalists. And Mengzi said that human nature and heaven was good. Xunzi thought that human nature was not good, was bad. We are led by our desires, and greed is important there. And heaven is neutral. So heaven is not good. It's not that you cultivate the goodness of heaven in your heart. So for monks, the key issue was benevolence or humanity, and cultivating your feelings. When you help somebody, Mengzi says, you get a warm feeling. So it gives you happiness. Mengzi didn't talk too much about ritual. Xunzi, on the other hand, didn't believe too much in benevolence first, but in propriety or rituals. You have to behave in certain ways, and then you can improve yourself. So in both Confucian philosophers here, they believe that everyone has the possibility to become a sage, but they disagreed on human nature and the ways to achieve this. When we talk about Neo-Confucianism and other Confucians in later times, it becomes even more complex. But that's an important issue within the Confucian traditions. Now, I have some questions for you, maybe for myself as well. We might discuss them. What would a Confucian do in times of lockdown? Would he or she organize webinars on Zoom? Would you wear a face mask when going outside? Would you visit your ill mother who lives in the other part of the country, even if the government forbids you to do so? So these are maybe some questions we might reflect about from a Confucian point of view, and there might be more answers possible, because, as I said, there are actually not the clear rules. You have to look at how you behave in the right situation. And of course, you can make progress. It's an exercise, it's a practice. Okay. Few words on Taoism. Taoism is considered to be the counterpart of Confucianism. Sometimes there are overlaps, they share certain terminology. The most famous book is the Lao Tzu, the classic of the way and its virtue. I translated as virtue in the Confucian context, but it's also kind of power, influence. You have from a Taoist point of view, when you embody the Tao, the way. And actually that counts also for Confucians. Like people said that Confucius was a very charming man. When he came somewhere, he could influence the situation. But okay, let's talk about Taoism now. For Taoists, and especially in the Lao Tzu, the ideal time is not the period of the early kings. That's already where a lot of things went wrong, according to Taoists, like society or how it's organized, and the very values of the Confucians, they made a big mess. In the Lao Tzu, the author or authors, we don't know who actually composed the text, they see the beginning of the beginnings of the cosmos as the ideal time. And actually in Taoist practice, the aim is to return to that early state. In Taoist, in the Tao Te Ching, there is also an ideal of a more primitive society where people don't hear what's happening in villages 1 mile away. So, there is also a problem with names. Like from a Taoist perspective, Confucians are fixing everything. While something can be benevolence for somebody, but it can be utterly wrong or do wrong to somebody else. So that's a criticism we see in the Tao Te Ching as well. There's some important concepts like non-action or non-intentional action, which is called Wei, and spontaneity or naturalness, Ziran, which are often mentioned in studies on the Taoist tradition. I don't have the time too much to go into detail, but I want to focus on Zhuangzi, who's not that well known, I think, in the West, but has a huge influence on East Asian culture, also on Japanese Zen Buddhism later on literature, on art. You see him here sitting, not sitting, sleeping, and it's a very famous story of Zhuangzi dreaming of being a butterfly, and then in his dream starts to wonder whether he's Zhuangzi dreaming of being the butterfly or the butterfly who sees Zhuangzi dreaming. So in Zhuangzi, you play with different multiple perspectives, with the relativity of things, which is an important theme. Also the limits of human knowledge. I have a short passage here translated by Burton Watson. You can't discuss the ocean with a well frog. He's limited by the space he lives in. You can't discuss ice with a summer insect. He's bound to a single season. You can't discuss the way with a cramped scholar. He's shackled by his doctrines. And that's also criticism on other philosophies. And Zhuangzi is a bit special. Also, the book is probably written by multiple authors because we have different voices in the text. But it doesn't want to pin you down in one point of view. And you might change also your point of view. And that's really important. I think it's also interesting to read a bit more Zhuangzi in times of lockdown. Zhuangzi is not about knowing that, but more about knowing how. There are a lot of stories in the Zhuangzi about virtuosity, about living life and knowing what to do. And skillsmen, craftsmen are often an example. There is the famous story of the cook, the butcher, who cuts up animals without, while keeping the knife very sharp, because knows how to do. It's a bit also like, it's often compared to when you learn to play music. So you learn, but then at one point that you have your knowledge, you cannot explain it in words, but you know how to do it. And then you're actually very free and can act while not really acting. And that's often explained in this way in the context of Taoist philosophy of Wu Wei. Zhuangzi is often also called a therapeutic philosophy. Wittgenstein also was talking about therapeutic philosophy, but therapeutic in the sense that Zhuangzi is different a bit from what we read in Lao Tzu, like going back to a more early form of society. Zhuangzi gives you the means to deal with the position or certain constraints you might have in society. And an author like Van Orden says, it's more about detachment in society, not from society. So you live in society, you don't need to go out of society, but you need to stay sane and safe. Other authors have called this genuine pretending as a kind of strategy. And they mean that you can be flexible in certain roles and you're not as sincere morally as a Confucian would be, because if you identify yourself too much with your role, for instance, you have a job and then a month later you lose your job, then and you don't know what else to do, then you might be in huge problems. So be flexible, perform while you're in a role, but not necessarily be actually true to yourself. Maybe you have much more possibilities than you think you have. So that's also something that you read very much in Zhuangzi. You have a lot of stories. There is a lot of humor. I already want to make some publicity for Nicole's talk about laughter. When you want an East Asian view on laughter, I would recommend you to read a bit more Zhuangzi. Sometimes he's talking also about outcasts in societies who become sages. Confucius he mocks Confucius as in many ways. Confucius has still a lot to learn. So there you have some interesting intertextuality as well. But Zhuangzi, well, as a human being, you have your constraints. You live in certain times, like for instance, now under lockdown. And one of the ways to deal with constraints is a certain attitude, an attitude which you could perfectly do when you're not in lockdown. That's really wandering around without a purpose, actually free at ease, like when you would observe fish in a pond, or other animals wandering around without a specific goal, but still be very attentive towards changes. And it's this kind of attitude that he also says you can do with your mind. So your mind can wander. Taoists, they also developed a lot of meditation techniques where you can wander around in your internal landscape inside your own body. And it's also about space. I mean, sometimes space can be very small, but in that smallness, you can discover that you have still some room to walk around, or the opposite, that something very big can actually be very small. So it's playing around with these perspectives. And I think that is a good way also to take on in life. Now, I'm
Yes,
leaving. Yeah.
keeping an eye on the time, and we're getting
Yes,
closer to.
I'm all. That's my last. Well,
Oh,
second
okay,
last
perfect.
slide. It's a long. There's still a long text, but um, Zhuang has a very interesting idea about life and death as well. A very, I think, in a way, that also teaches you how to be a bit more relativistic, maybe. He has a story about his own death, so that's why we know he didn't write the text himself, probably. But another famous story is about his wife. So I read the translation. When Zhuangzi's wife died, Huizi came to mourn her. At that moment, Zhuangzi was squatting down, beating a tap and singing. Huizi said, "You lived with this person, raised children, and grew older together. Not to cry when she died would be bad enough, but you beat the tap singing. Isn't that too much?" Zhuangzi said, "No. When she first died, don't you think I was like everyone else? But then I considered her beginning, before she was alive. Not only before she had life, but before she had form. Not only before she had form, but before she had qi. In all the mixed up bustle and confusion, something changed and there was qi. The qi changed and there was form. The form changed and she had life. Today there was another change and she died. It's just like the round of the four seasons, spring, summer, fall, and winter. She was resting quietly, perfectly at home, and I followed her crying. Ah, it seemed like I hadn't comprehended fate, so I stopped. So, I mean, Zhuangzi was sad, so it's not the case that from a Zhuangzi's point of view, there are no emotions and that death of a family member doesn't do anything to you. But that's maybe the initial response. And he looks at it from a larger perspective. And that's maybe also a healthy attitude, maybe something we can discuss as well, and maybe more difficult or to do than to say. Um, anyway, this looking at keeping yourself sane, working with emotions, and that's the last thing I say, is also actually important from a Confucian perspective, like keeping yourself in the center. But there is much more to say how all these traditions differ, overlap. I didn't mention some other important traditions, but I hope I inspired you to learn a bit more, like learning Chinese philosophy when you have a little bit more time, and compare and contrast with what you know from your own traditions. So thank you very much, and if you have questions, let me know, and we might have also an interesting discussion.